Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography. Written by Chiang Meng-lin, read by Tang Da-ming.
Chapter 27. War. When Beiping was peaking, the city was a center of intellectual activities and the student movement. When it became Beiping, it turned into the center of Sino-Japanese conflict. During the early months of 1937, one incident after another happened in the vicinity. The arrow was drawn and must in time fly. With lightning speed, it went off at the Marco Polo Bridge. On the night of July 7th, the Japanese army, under cover of darkness, suddenly shelled the outskirts of the city from their side of the bridge, and the Chinese army stationed in the city returned fire. I was at Guling, a summer resort on the Middle Yangtze, when the war god descended upon Beiping. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek had summoned a group of intellectuals for discussion of national problems in the cool Guling Mountains during those hot summer days. The sky was clear, and patches of shade from the trees made lace-like patterns on the green lawns. One day after lunch, as I was resting in a one-room cottage, one of a group of houses the Generalissimo had set aside for his guests, and was looking through the window into a tall shady tree and listening to the singing of the cicadas. Cheng Cangbo, editor of the Central Daily News, broke the quiet of the noon hour by knocking at the door with the news that the Japanese had struck at Marco Polo Bridge the previous night. I leapt from the bed and inquired for further details. There were none. We discussed the possibilities. As I was fresh from Beiping, he asked my opinion from what I knew of conditions in the city. I told him that from my impression of the Japanese commanding generals there and their conservative views, the thing looked like another local incident. The Japanese plan seemed to be to bite off the Chinese cheese piece by piece, and I was not inclined to think they were ready to swallow the whole chunk. But by this policy of slow motion, gnawing off a bit from time to time and slowly accumulating day after day, in a few years they would have entrenched themselves firmly in North China, and it would be difficult to dislodge them. The Yangtze Valley would be at their mercy. Japan had swallowed up northeast China, which they referred to as Manchuria, by a slow process, and had then come to North China. What Manchuria was to North China, so North China was to the south. The same method and the same process. That seemed to be the policy of the Japanese vis-à-vis China. There was desultory fighting for some days. 12 days later, as skirmishing went on outside the city, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, in an address to several thousand officers from various armies in the country who were under training in the Guling Training Center, expressed the view that the Japanese were about to launch a general war against China, and we must get ready to defend the country at any cost. But if such a general war should start, he said, we must be ready to sacrifice. It will be a long war, and the longer it drags on, the more we shall suffer. It was the first time I had heard him speak in such unequivocal terms of the Japanese question. General Chen Cheng, General Hu Zongnan, and other commanding generals of the Chinese armies who later distinguished themselves at the various fronts were among the listeners. A few days after this speech, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek returned to Nanjing by air, and the commanding generals rejoined their respective armies. With some of my friends, I flew to the capital and tried to get back to Beiping, but northbound trains were all suspended. In about 2 weeks, the war was spreading like a flood in the vicinity of Beiping. General Song Zheyuan fought gallantly as casualties mounted. The commander of the Japanese army, Tashiro, with whose conservative views regarding China problems I was well acquainted, fell ill, and the radical younger officers got control of the Japanese forces. After a few days, General Tashiro died. Was it illness, suicide, or assassination? Rumors were rampant, but nobody could find out the truth. General Song Zheyuan still clung to the idea of localizing the incident and urged the central government troops, which were being rushed northward, to stop at Baoding. And at Baoding, accordingly, they made a halt. But the Japanese army, now under the direction of young officers, did not stop. Song's forces were attacked by the enemy right and left and on all sides. One of the commanding generals died in action. Finally, General Song withdrew from Beiping, and the Japanese entered the city without firing a shot. Now the Japanese had control of Beiping. Would North China suffer the same fate as Manchuria after they occupied Mukden some 6 years earlier? Would Japan stop at North China for the moment, wait a few years more, and use that base for a further attack on South China? Or was she tired of waiting? Would she strike at South China with a single blow and get the thing done once and for all? Either way seemed possible. The plan of slow motion seemed on the whole more dangerous to China. All the ranking officers in Nanjing and the military leaders in the provinces favored a countrywide resistance to the aggression. All China, officials, generals, and the people stood up as one man to face the greatest calamity in history to fall upon the country. Meanwhile, Japan began to dispatch troops to Shanghai from across the sea. China, at the same time, rushed her own troops down the Yangtze to the same port. In that small area, face to face, were massed tens of thousands of men. A tiny spark would set off a terrific explosion in the powder magazine. It was immaterial which side should strike it first, whether by the accidental discharge of a gun by a careless soldier without orders, or by the policy of men high up in power. The Japanese army knew very well that the men responsible for the Mukden incident, such as Generals Honjo and Doihara, had received the highest rewards and honors for their meritorious acts. Those responsible for the Marco Polo Bridge incident were to receive like honors, there was no doubt. Who could blame the commanding generals from across the sea for aspiring to similar rewards? All of us in Nanjing knew that the thick war clouds hanging over the whole country were bound to break into a storm. I left for Hangzhou by motor car to stay with a friend in a villa on the historic West Lake. In the serene quiet of the place, I had the chance to muse over the past and think of the future. Every day and every succeeding night, we expected a clash between the two opposing forces in that tightly congested area of Shanghai. Every now and then, my friend Wang Wenbo telephoned to Shanghai to inquire about the situation. On August 12th, the voice at the other end replied abruptly, "No news. Tomorrow at 10, that's all." The receiver was hung up. Next morning, the fatal hour struck. Smoke rose sky high. Bombers from both sides blasted the lines of the opposing forces. A full-scale war had begun. There would be no more local incidents, no more piecemeal ways. Japan must either gobble up all China or give it up. But gobble she could not, quite, and give up she would not. It was bound to be a long drawn-out war. 2 days later, on a cloudy afternoon, I was sitting under a willow tree, watching the fish shuttling back and forth in the shallows of the lake. Peals of thunder were audible over the other side of the city. The telephone rang for me. "Hello? Do you hear that?" More thunder. "Yes, it's thundering." "No, the enemy is bombing our airfield." 7 bombers had flown over from Taiwan without escort. They were met by Chinese fighters stationed at Hangzhou, and 5 were shot down on the spot. The remaining 2 flew for their lives and were forced to land at some distance. The pilots were captured, and we learned that they had been told by their commanding officers that there were no fighter planes in China. Next day, the Japanese bombed Nanjing. In the beginning of the war, the enemy dropped only 1 bomb at any one place, so that all their bombs were scattered. This caused much less damage than concentrated bombing, which they learned a year later from the Russians at Zhanggaofeng, a border town between Manchuria and Siberia where they had a clash with Soviet forces. My friend Wang Wenbo was a member of the Zhejiang provincial government and commissioner of reconstruction. He had to get busy. Hundreds of trucks were taken over from the bus lines and munitions shipped to the front in them. Once a fleet of some 20 such trucks was sent to the front. It ran into the rear of the enemy and was fired upon. One truck driver got out of his car and hid in the fields. Under cover of darkness, he crawled on his stomach through the enemy lines and came back to Hangzhou. A few days later, he found another truck and dashed off again for the front. Refugees from Shanghai poured into Hangzhou. The temples were filled with women and children. Humble huts in the mountains were turned into temporary homes for fashionable young ladies. They talked and laughed as if nothing had happened to them. The Chinese were always in good humor, even in time of danger. A friend of mine, formerly a cotton magnate, came to Hangzhou with his daughters and young children and lived in a temple up in the mountains. He told me that he would like to build a house for his family. "What for?" I asked. "I should like to stay in Hangzhou during the war in Shanghai," he said. I was surprised at his idea of the war. I told him that he had better move into the interior, as the war would surely spread to Hangzhou and all coastal cities, and perhaps up the Yangtze as far as Hankou. He was stunned and could not believe my words. 5 years later, I met him in Chongqing, where he told me that he and his family had left Hangzhou before war descended upon the West Lake. In Nanjing, a plan was afoot for the evacuation of 3 of the northern universities, Peking and Tsinghua universities in Beiping and Nankai University in Tianjin. These 3 institutions were to combine into a union university at Changsha, an inland city on the upper Yangtze. Hu Shi telephoned from the capital and asked me to go back to Nanjing to put the scheme into effect. I did not welcome the idea, but was finally forced to accept the plan. There are things in the world which you do not want to do but must do in the end, willy-nilly. Like war itself. When war comes, you find yourself fighting whether you like it or not. This was my attitude toward the Associated University. Knowing that I would be unable to see my father's home again before the end of the war, and that the hazards of war are difficult to foresee, I borrowed a Buick from a friend and drove home. My father, now very old, was all smiles. When I left again for Nanjing, I told him that China would be reborn through fire and blood. "What do you mean?" he asked, giving me a steady look from his twinkling eyes. "The thing is this. The war will be a long war. Hundreds and thousands of houses will be burned, and thousands and millions of lives will be lost. This is what I mean by fire and blood. And in the end, China will emerge victorious." When I left him, I had the feeling that most probably I would not see my beloved father again, to whom I owed so much and had returned so little. When bombs visited the native city of my boyhood days, he moved into the mountains and there enjoyed his trees, flowers, and birds. After 2 years of war, he got up early one morning as usual and felt dizzy. He went back to bed, and there his spirit fled, at the age of nearly 80. He was but one of many indirect casualties of war. War is rather hard on old people. I stayed at Nanjing for several days and then boarded a steamer sailing upriver for Hankou. Near the docks, wooden boxes containing government archives, books of the Central University Library, and art treasures from the Palace Museum were piled high along the banks of the Yangtze, ready for shipment. And on the way to Hankou, we met boat after boat packed with troops steaming down the river to reinforce Shanghai. From Hankou, I took the Guangzhou-Hankou Railway to Changsha. On the way, we met trainloads of troops crowded in open cars, coming up to Hankou from Guangzhou and Guangxi. The war was now really on a national footing, not a mere local war as heretofore. The spirit of the fighting men was high. I asked where they were going. "Fight the Japs," they replied with zest.
What you just heard is Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography, written by Chiang Meng-lin, read by Tang Da-min, and published by the Foreign Language Teaching and Research Press. Some names and terminologies in this book have been updated per contemporary usages.